Okay, next we're going to talk about sexual reproduction. So the first thing we'll look at is an introduction. Sexual reproduction occurs when two parents mix genes in order to produce offspring. They are not identical. So this is what we are familiar with as sexual reproduction. And sexual reproduction, there are two genetically unique individuals, which we call parents, and they do produce offspring that are genetically unique. Next, we'll look at advantages and then disadvantages. Now, if I go too fast for you to do your notes, again, you have the link to the Prezi, so you can take your time and go back and look at these if you'd like. So the advantages of sexual reproduction, and this is quite obvious, one of the big ones is high genetic variation. So I mentioned before that genetic variation is essential to the survival of a species. So the more varied the traits, the more likely it is that individuals in the population are able to withstand changes in the environment. And it's typically environmental pressures. It could be introduction of prey, it could be climate change, but those are the things that really knock out a species. So if a species is going to become threatened or endangered or even extinct, it's due to environmental pressures. But the more variation there is in a species, the more likely it is that some individuals will survive and that species will not become extinct. Organisms are able to adapt. Again, that kind of goes back with the more variations in the species, the more likely it is that there are adaptations, which are characteristics that make organisms more fit for their particular environment, that they're more likely to have those adaptations and survive. And not all bad genes are passed on. So when you're talking about sexual reproduction, what we'll go through in this class is meiosis or meiosis, and this is the process of making egg and sperm cells. And we'll see how, we have 46 chromosomes as humans, but what you pass on to the next generation is only 23 of those. So you're not going to pass on all of your genes. So if there are some genes that are undesirable, there's a good possibility that they will not be passed on to the next generation. Okay, next we'll go to disadvantages. So this can be complicated. Um, the process, like I mentioned, of making egg and sperm cells is called meiosis. It is not a process that is imperfect. There are opportunities along the way for mistakes. So mistakes can happen. Smaller populations are produced because you're dealing with organisms that are more complicated and you're dealing with a more complicated process. And then it does require courtship and mating. So you might have heard of like alpha males. Some of the other males may not have a mate because they're not the alpha male, so they don't get a mate. So that is a disadvantage of sexual reproduction. So now we're going to look at plants and then animals. So we'll start with animals because we are in the kingdom Animalia. So when we're talking about animals, male gametes and female gametes contain half of the usual number of chromosomes or genes. Male gametes and gametes are sex cells. Male gametes are sperm cells, and female gametes are egg cells, and they contain half the usual number of chromosomes. So if we were to examine a skin cell of an animal, a human animal, we would find 46 chromosomes, but in an egg, 23, in sperm, also 23. During fertilization, the two fuse together to form a zygote, a fertilized egg. So fertilization is the union of egg and sperm to create a new organism. That very first cell is called a zygote. So we go from 23, a unique 23, plus another unique 23 makes a unique 46 individual when we're talking about humans. Okay, now to plants. In plants, male and female gametes unite to produce new offspring. Now, when we're talking about male and female gametes in plants, typically what we would refer to the female parts as the pistil or carpel, depends on how you've learned it in the past, and then the stamen, so the anther and the filament for the males. And when you're talking about flowering plants, they do have the male and female on the same plant. So self-pollination is possible. The pollen, the male gamete in flowering plants, and the egg, the ovum is the female gamete. Now here is a picture that I took last summer. I took a class over at UVA Wise, and I had this flowering plant, and we just dissected it. We just took it apart, and what we were looking for is we were looking for reproductive structures. So the reproductive structures, one of the obvious parts is this female part, and we had a big, huge, long discussion about whether you call it a carpel, do you call it pistils? Is a pistil a collection of multiple carpels? Is a carpel a collection of multiple pistils? It was a big mess. I kind of just blanked out that whole entire conversation. But either way you look at it, in the female part down here is the ovum, which is equivalent to a female egg, and it is located in the ovary. Up at the top is something called the stigma, and it's sticky, so if pollen comes flying along, it's going to stick there. And then this part, the skinny part, is called a style. Um, then we have the male parts, and you can see I pulled those out. Here they are. So up at the top is the anther. It's the flat top, and that's where the pollen comes from. Pollen is equivalent to sperm in humans. And then this is the filament. So this is the area where it's going to attach to the plant itself. So even though you're talking about all of this being on the same plant, it's still sexual reproduction because the female, the ovum, has its own genetic makeup and the pollen has its own unique genetic makeup as well. Okay, so again, if I went too fast, you can go back to the Prezi, take your time and explore and complete your notes.